Hey, I'm Sean, this is High Valley Hobbies, and today we're going to be painting your very first miniature. I'm going to be taking you step by step into how to turn this into something a little bit more like this. Let's get started. Okay, so in this video, I'm going to assume you have a basic mini painting setup and a few of the essential tools and paints you'll need to get started. If you are brand new and don't have any of those things, I recommend checking out my video on how to get started in the hobby on a budget right up here. Keeping in the spirit of being for beginners, I'm going to limit myself to only using a basic set of synthetic brushes and a limited set of paints for this model. I'm going to be painting this Tiefling Rogue from the WizKids D&D Frameworks line. Even though this is a miniature made for Dungeons & Dragons, the steps we're going through in this video can be used to assemble and paint pretty much any model for any game out there. Before we get to painting, we will need to do a little prep work on the model first. Prepping models made of resin or metal will be a little bit different, but the vast majority of models, especially those sold in game stores beginners are likely to pick up, are made of polystyrene plastic. The first thing we need to do after opening up the box is take a look at the directions. Most models are pretty straightforward, but some multi-part kits can get pretty complicated to put together. Some arms might only fit certain torsos, or you might even need to assemble parts in a specific order, or you might find that the connection point for something important, like the head, is totally blocked. Next, we need to remove all of the parts from the sprue. The sprue is this gray plastic frame that holds all the different parts together. To do this, use a pair of clippers like these ones right here, but you can also use a hobby knife or a scalpel in a pinch if you're really careful. With the flat side of your clippers facing the model, make the necessary cuts around each part to remove them from the sprue. I recommend leaving 1 millimeter or 2 of sprue on the model to minimize the chance of snipping off anything you're not supposed to. But don't worry, we'll be cleaning up everything a little bit later. Once all of your parts are off the sprue, take your hobby knife and gently remove the rest of those connection points. Work slowly here and only take off a little bit of plastic at a time. Working too fast is a recipe for damaging your model or slicing your fingers. So take your time and be patient. After that, take all of your parts and look for these faint lines running across them. Those lines are from when the hot plastic was injected into the model's mold. They sometimes leave behind marks from where the pieces of the mold were sandwiched together. They're easily removed by gently scraping with the backside of your hobby knife or using some fine grit sandpaper. Just like the last step, work slowly and only remove a little plastic at a time until you have a smooth surface. Now let's put everything together. This model has several different options for heads and arms, so I'm going to take a little bit of time to dry fit the parts together without any glue first to see what I want the final model to look like. This step will also show me where the parts all fit together once I do use glue. This is a rogue after all, so I'm kind of digging this sword and dagger look. Now that I have all the parts I need off the sprue and cleaned up, I'm taking some plastic cement and gluing everything together. Plastic cement is amazing for working with these polystyrene plastic models. It's a mild solvent that actually melts the plastic just a little bit and bonds the parts together for a super secure fit. Just a dab'll do ya, and a few seconds holding the two parts together. But if your models are made out of resin, metal, or any other material, plastic glue just won't work. That means super glue is what you'll want to use. Super glue also works just fine on plastic models too if you don't have plastic cement. Now I know we have everything all assembled and looking great, but there's still one more step before we can start painting. We have to apply a primer coat. While you can paint your minis without priming them, the paint will have a much harder time sticking to the surface and can do some really weird things like bead up or pool in areas you don't want it to. But if you do manage to get the paint on smooth, it will run the risk of chipping off a lot easier than if there's a primer coat below it for the paint to adhere to. You'll want to shake your spray can really well and head outside or to a room with really good ventilation. You do not want to be breathing in the fumes from a spray can. Be sure to move the paint spray across your model in short bursts just like this. Too much spray at once will clog details on the model and will take much longer to dry. You don't need that much primer on the model to get it ready for painting. My models are usually dry enough to start painting after about 10 or 15 minutes of drying. Alright, once that primer is done to the touch, we're finally ready to put some paint down. There are no rules when it comes to what colors you can use here. Hot pink Space Marines? Go for it. Want to paint your orcs blue? More power to you. Unless you're planning on playing in a tournament, there might be a requirement of 3 colors per model or something like that, but we're not going to get into that here. For this model, I'm looking to the box art for inspiration. I like how eye-catching the red skin is and the white accent of the undershirt, but I think I'm going to go with a dark green overcoat with lighter green fringes for a little more contrast. Green and red are on opposite ends of the color wheel, so that should bring a little more visual interest to the model than if I went with the dark purple look of the box art. Along with our white, red, and greens, I'm also going to be using a black, a dark brown for her pants and all the leather bits, and a gold and a silver for the metallic parts like her weapons and accents on her jacket. I'll also be using a black wash and a brown wash for our shading step. I'm not going to be mentioning specific paint brands in this video because, spoiler alert, it doesn't really matter, and also it's a lot easier to follow along when I say things like dark green instead of Wah Flesh. Sorry, Games Workshop. We're going to be using the tried and true base coat, shade, and highlight method that's been around for years. Is it the quickest way to paint up a model to a reasonable standard? No. But it is a great way for beginners to hone in those skills of brush control and where to place highlights and shadows that will come in handy as you learn more advanced techniques and take on more ambitious projects. The only piece of special equipment I am using is my trusty wet palette. Don't worry if you don't have one, you'll be able to paint just fine without it, but you'll probably have to add just a little bit more water to your paints to keep them from drying out. If you want to buy one, you can pick one up at a local art store or online for about $10 or $15. When it comes to what size brush to use, you'll want to use the biggest brush you think you can get away with. A lot of beginners, me included, think they need the smallest brush possible to paint small models. Having a brush big enough to hold a good amount of paint while still having a sharp point is way more important. I'll be using this size 4 for the majority of this model. We're going to start with the hardest to reach area first. That means the face. Give your paint a good shake, then get a drop or 2 of your red paint on your palette and thin it down with just a little bit of water from your brush. This will help the paint flow off of your paintbrush onto your model and dry nice and smooth, which is what we're looking for. Load up the tip of your brush with some paint and give it a little twist as you pick it up. This will help keep a nice sharp point for all of those small details. Now, working carefully, pick out the skin on her face, hands, and horns. Don't just glob paint on your model. Work sparingly and go back to your palette when you need more paint. We don't want to clog up any of those details. It's also a good idea to clean off your brush periodically to make sure no paint is drying in your bristles. Just swish it around in a cup of water and wipe it off on a piece of paper towel. You also obviously want to do this when you're switching colors too. Try not to spill over onto other parts of the model too much here, but it's not a big deal if you do. We can always cover up our mistakes later with other colors, which I think is one of the biggest advantages of this base coat method. You'll probably notice that after your first coat, the paint has dried a little transparent and splotchy. This is totally normal, and all we have to do is repeat the process over until we get a nice opaque coverage on our model. I needed 3 coats before I was happy with the skin. Oh, and don't forget her tail. There's also a tiny bit sticking out the back that's really easy to miss. With our base coat down on the skin, let's move on to the biggest part of the model, her overcoat. Same process as before. Thin your paint with a little water, twist your brush to get a sharp tip, don't put too much paint on at once, and repeat as many times as necessary to get opaque coverage. Next, let's pick out the accents on her coat with our lighter green. Same steps as before. You'll notice a pattern here. Feel free to switch to a smaller brush if you need to, and pro tip, you can use the side of your brush to catch the edges of some of these smaller details. Sometimes it's a little bit easier than just using the tip. And always move the model to get a good angle, not the brush. This helps make sure your hand stays steady and you minimize the chances of a mistake. But just like with the face, don't worry if you spill over onto another part of the model. We can always go back with another color later. There are also other ways to fix your mistakes. Say I get a little bit of this green somewhere I don't want it, like this bit right here. All I have to do is quickly wash my brush in water, dab off the excess on a piece of paper towel, and gently wipe away the still wet paint with my damp brush. Just like that, good as new. After that, let's move on to all the brown bits. That means all the leather accents get a nice base coat in our dark brown. I wanted a little bit of variation for her pants, so I mixed in a little black to my brown on my palette to get an even deeper brown and used that as the base on those trousers. A little bit of black for the boots and hair, and we're on to her white shirt. One of the biggest downsides to using a black primer is that lighter colors like white and particularly yellow usually need quite a few coats before they're opaque. Just be patient here and use as many coats of your thinned down white as you need to get opaque coverage. I needed 3. I also decided to add a shock of white to her hair for a little bit more visual interest. Alright, starting to look like something. Moving on to our metallic paint, you'll either want to change out your paint water entirely or use a separate cup for your metallic paint. You really don't want to contaminate your regular paint with metallic flakes. Painting with metallics can be a little tricky sometimes, but you just use the same process as before. Thin the paint down a little on the palette first and use as many coats as you need. I'm using silver on both her weapons as well as any other accent pieces like her various buckles. I'm going to pick out a few extra bits like the detailing on her dagger and the buttons on her coat in gold. I think it will add some nice variation to break up all that silver. With that, our base coats are done. The model doesn't look bad, but maybe a little plain. That's where our shading step comes in. Now that all of our base coats are down and our mistakes are cleaned up, we can start to apply washes to our model to shade the recesses and bring a little more definition to all of our colors. I usually work with washes on a dry palette. Since washes tend to be a lot more fluid than regular acrylic paint, I find I can better control my mixtures there than on a wet palette. I'm going to start with a brown wash. Load up your brush with some wash and apply it to all of the brown parts like her belt, pants, and other bits. I'm also going to use that same brown wash on her skin, horns, and any gold like the detail on her dagger and buttons on her jacket. Despite their beginner-friendly reputation, washes actually take a bit of practice to really get right. Thanks to gravity, washes like to pool in certain areas of your model. This is what you want in some cases, but in others it can leave unnatural shadows and take away from the effect you're trying to achieve. While the wash is still wet, take a damp brush and soak up any excess that might pool up. Like right here on her neck. How about that? You can already see the details in her face and fingers becoming just that little bit more defined. Next, with our black wash, paint it on all the silver parts like her weapons and buckles. For this next step, I don't want details like her white shirt and green jacket to get too dark, so we're going to make a 50-50 mix of black wash and water, then apply it all over her jacket, shirt, and hair. Just like before, be sure to look for any unnatural pooling and clean it up with a damp brush before it starts to dry. Speaking of drying, washes usually need a bit longer to dry than regular paint does. Even though you can usually go over your acrylics with another coat after only a few minutes, I'd say you should wait at least a good 30 minutes for your washes to fully dry. After this step, you can actually call it good. Plenty of people stop painting right here, and their models look great. But for not that much more effort, we can make our models really pop on the table with my favorite part about mini painting. Adding highlights. We want our washes to be completely dry before adding our highlights. To start, we're going to go back to our original base coat colors and reapply them, but only on the raised surfaces of all the details. You want to avoid the deepest recesses where the majority of the wash pooled to keep all the contrast we just created. A little more dark green on the folds of her jacket, lighter green on the highest portions of the detailing, brown on the edges of the belts, scabbards, and pants, and white on the corners of her shirt. For her skin, carefully pick out each finger and the most prominent features of her face like her nose and cheekbones. Be sure to catch a few of the ridges on her horns too. When it comes to metallics, the shinier the edge, the sharper it looks. So take a little bit of silver paint and run the side of your brush along the edge of her daggers and the edges of her buckles. Same with the gold. Pick out the tallest parts and dot the buttons one more time. The effect of this step is pretty subtle at first, so we're going to take it even further with a second level of highlights. Adding just a touch of white to our base colors, go over the folds of her jacket one more time, but this time only focusing on the sharpest points. Do the same thing with your brown and red, but only add this layer to the upward-facing parts of her face, belt, and pants. This will create the illusion of a light source shining down on her and add even more eye-catching contrast. I actually decided the jacket wasn't popping enough for my eye, so I added in even more white and gave only the sharpest bits another layer of highlights. Nice. Looking good. Highlighting black can be a little tricky, but it is possible. Add the tiniest bit of white to your black to get a dark charcoal gray and pick out the most prominent strands of hair and the tops of her boots. This next step is totally optional, but now we're going to paint her eyes. Eyes on models of this scale are so small that most people won't even notice if they're not there, but we're going to give it a go. The best way I've found is to start with a deep, dark brown, just like the one we used to base coat her pants, and add it to where her eye sockets are. If you mess up, don't worry. Just wait for it to dry and fix it with some red. To add the whites of her eyes, take some white paint on your smallest and sharpest brush and dot each corner of her eye. This part is really hard, so don't get discouraged if it takes you a while, because it totally didn't take me 4 tries to get this right on camera. There's one more step to go before we can call this model done. You want to base your model in a way that fits the environment it's going to play in. That could be a desert wasteland, or a frozen tundra, or a grassy field. This model happens to have a little bit of sculpted detail that she's standing on. Since this is going to be used for Dungeons & Dragons, I'm going to keep this pretty simple. Take some of your dark gray paint that's left over from our highlighting step and give the rock a good base coat. After that's dry, we're going to take a lighter gray and use a technique called dry brushing. Be sure to use an old beat-up brush here. Once you have paint on your brush, you're actually going to wipe the majority of it off on something hard and a little absorbent like a bit of cardboard until only the faintest bit of paint comes off. Like right here, on my hand. By dragging your brush across the rocky detail, you'll see that paint only gets deposited on the highest parts. Keep going until you're satisfied with the amount of contrast. After that, slop on some black wash to tie everything together and touch up the base rim with some black paint, and that's it. We are done. Congratulations! You just painted your very first miniature. The first of many, I hope. I even learned a few things going back to this way of painting minis. Over the years, I've gotten more and more into a hybrid style of painting where I use both transparent paints like contrast and speed paint in tandem with acrylics. And going back to this method, which is the way I learned how to paint, really hammered home how valuable that base of skills like brush control and where to place your highlights and shadows is for beginners. Also, while the synthetic brushes I used work just fine and are perfect for beginners, I really started to miss my nice sable hair brushes, especially when it came to those really fine details that required a lot of precision. I just find that I have so much more control over my paint and the bristles when I have my nice sable hair brushes. Definitely worth the investment if you have the budget for it. If I had to do this all over again, I would probably also pick a different model. I really like this WizKids D&D model and I can't wait to use it on the tabletop, but I think the scale is just a little bit too small for a beginner-friendly painting experience. Some details, particularly her face, were so hard to pick out that I felt like I was fighting the model at times, or just had to sketch highlights on where I assumed details would be on a bigger model. A more heroic scale 32mm model with more exaggerated features like hands, weapons, and faces would probably have been a better choice. Modern day Games Workshop models are a joy to paint for this exact reason. They are built with the painting experience in mind. Also, painting on camera is super difficult. Props to all you other content creators out there that are doing this much better than I am. Like and subscribe if you want to see more, and let me know what I should name this tiefling rogue when my D&D party encounters her in our next play session down in the comments below. Thanks for stopping by. Till next time.